The final hiss of the steam engine was a sound of profound finality. For Charlotte May Avery. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a 700-mile sentence, a journey that had carried her from the damp, predictable soil of Kansas to the stark, thirsty plains of the Arizona Territory. She stood on the raw timber platform of the Dry Hollow station, a solitary figure in a well-worn gray traveling dress, her hands clutching the handle of a small, scuffed leather trunk that held everything she owned in the world. The sun was a merciless white disk in a bleached blue sky. It beat down on the single, wide street of the town, turning the dust to a fine, pale powder that rose with every gust of wind. The air was thin and carried the scent of hot rock, horse, and something else, an arid emptiness that felt a world away from the green humidity she had left behind. Dry Hollow was not a town that whispered welcomes. It shouted its harsh realities from the unpainted facades of the general store, the saloon, and the blacksmith's shop, where the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil was the only steady heartbeat in the midday stillness. He was not there. Charlotte scanned the few faces milling about a pair of weathered cowboys loading sacks onto a wagon, a woman in a sunbonnet herding two small children, the station master rolling a cigarette with practiced indifference. None of them was Silas Croft. She felt a flicker, not of panic, but of a practical, gnawing concern. In his letters, 7 months of them, his script neat and deliberate on the thin, precious paper. He had been a man of details. Asterisk, I will be at the station with the buckboard wagon. Asterisk, he had written in his last dispatch. Asterisk, you will know me by my gray hat and the fact I will be the only man there looking as if his future has just arrived on the afternoon train. Asterisk. His words had been a balm to a life that had grown quiet and small. A widower, he had written, with 160 acres of good bottomland that wanted for a woman's touch. He wrote not of passion, but of partnership. He spoke of needing a steady hand to help with the canning, a kind heart to share the long winter evenings, a companion to build a life with against the unforgiving landscape. He never once mentioned her looks, her age, or her prospects, only asking if she was of strong constitution and not afraid of hard work. For Charlotte, who had just buried her mother and sold the small family home to settle the debts, his proposal was not a flight of fancy, but a plank of wood in a churning sea. She was 32, considered past her prime, and possessed of a quiet nature that was often mistaken for plainness. The letters were a promise of a place to belong. She adjusted her bonnet, tying the ribbons tighter against a wind that seemed determined to pry into her thoughts. Perhaps his wagon had thrown a wheel. Perhaps a calf had gone missing. The West, she understood, was a place of sudden and inconvenient truths. A man's schedule was not his own, but a hostage to the whims of livestock, weather, and distance. "Ma'am," the station master's voice was gravelly. "You waiting on someone?" "Mr. Silas Croft," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "from the farm north of town." The man paused his cigarette rolling, his eyes squinting at her from beneath the brim of a stained hat. He gave a noncommittal shrug. "Croft's place is a good 2-mile walk. Straight up that road, past the church. Can't miss it. Sits on a low rise." He licked the paper, sealed his cigarette, and seemed to lose all interest in her plight. 2 miles. The trunk felt heavier now, the sun hotter. But to sit and wait felt like an admission of helplessness, a luxury she could not afford. She had not come all this way to be a damsel in distress on a train platform. She was to be a partner, a wife. She would start by walking to her new home. With a grunt, she hefted the trunk. Her arms, conditioned by years of kneading dough and hauling water, protested the unfamiliar strain. She began her walk, her boots sinking into the thick dust of the main road. The stares of the townsfolk were not unkind, merely curious. A woman, alone, with a traveling trunk. It was a story they had seen before, with varying endings. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, on the small, white spire of the chapel that marked the edge of town. Each step was an act of faith, a reaffirmation of the words on the pages tucked safely in her valise. Once past the last of the buildings, the silence deepened, broken only by the crunch of her own footsteps and the low moan of the wind sweeping across the plains. The landscape was vast and humbling, a palette of browns and ochres under the immense sky. The Croft farmstead appeared just as the station master had said, a collection of sturdy, sensible buildings on a gentle slope. The house was whitewashed, the paint peeling in places but still clinging with a stubborn brightness. A large barn stood behind it, and neat rows of withered cornstalks in a garden spoke of a harvest brought in. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the stark blue. Hope, which had wavered, surged anew. The smoke meant someone was home. He was there, perhaps delayed by a chore, unaware of the time. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She set the trunk down at the wooden gate, catching her breath and smoothing the front of her dress. She took a moment to compose herself, to shed the dust and weariness of the road and become the woman from the letters, the promised bride arriving at her new life. She walked up the short, packed earth path to the front porch. 2 rocking chairs sat empty, waiting. The front door was made of thick, planed wood, solid and reassuring. She raised her hand, her knuckles hovering for a second before she gave 3 firm raps. The sound was loud in the quiet air. She waited, hearing a faint shuffling from within. Her heart beat a quick, expectant rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the moment the face from her imagination would become real. The door creaked open, not all the way, but just enough for a woman to peer out. She was young, no more than 20, Charlotte guessed. Her hair was a pale, corn silk blonde, pulled back in a loose, untidy braid. Her dress was simple, faded calico, and her feet were bare against the wooden floorboards. But it was her eyes that held Charlotte's gaze large, blue, and filled with a weariness that didn't belong to her youth. She looked at Charlotte, then at the trunk by the gate, and a flicker of something fear, or perhaps pity, passed through them. Yes, the young woman's voice was soft, barely a whisper. Charlotte cleared her throat, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Mr. Silas Croft. He was expecting me." The hesitation was a betrayal, a crack in her composure she hadn't intended. The young woman's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment before rising again to meet Charlotte's. She opened the door a little wider, as if the statement required more space to exist in the world. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words, when they came, were as quiet and as devastating as a final breath. "I'm his wife." The world did not tilt. The sun did not fall from the sky. The wind continued its ceaseless journey across the plains. But for Charlotte May Avery, everything stopped. The air in her lungs turned to glass. The neat and deliberate script of the letters in her valise curled into black ash in her mind. The promise, the plank of wood she had clung to, dissolved into splinters, leaving her adrift in the churning silence. She saw the young woman's lips move again, but no sound registered. She was a figure behind thick, wavy glass. The whitewashed house, the waiting rocking chairs, the welcoming smoke from the chimney, it all became a painted backdrop for a cruel joke. The 7 months of correspondence, the shared hopes for the future, the careful planning, the arduous journey, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies. He had not just been a widower seeking a companion. He had been a man seeking what? A diversion, a game. Charlotte did not ask. She did not speak. To ask why would be to demand an explanation from a world that clearly offered none. To speak would be to let out the scream that was building in her chest, a scream of humiliation, of rage, of a foolishness so profound it stole her breath. She looked at the girl, the asterisk wife asterisk, and saw not a rival, but another victim. The weariness in her eyes was not just from farm work. It was the heavy toll of being shackled to a man who wrote letters to other women. And so, Charlotte did not cry. The tears were there, a hot, solid lump in her throat, but she would not grant them passage. Her pride, the only thing she had left that was truly her own, was a dam holding them back. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an acknowledgment of the woman's statement, but an acceptance of her own reality. The door had not opened for her. It never would. She turned around, her back straight, her shoulders squared. She did not look back at the woman in the doorway, or at the house that was supposed to have been her home. She walked down the path, her steps measured and deliberate. She did not retrieve her trunk from the gate. It felt impossibly heavy now, weighted not with her belongings, but with the full, crushing gravity of a life that would not be. Let it sit there. Let it be a monument to her folly. She walked back the way she had come, but she did not go toward the main street of Dry Hollow. She could feel the town's curious eyes even from a distance. She would not give them a spectacle. She would not let them see her unravel. Skirting the edge of the settlement, her gaze fell upon the collection of buildings by the railroad tracks. One of them, set back a little from the station, was a large stable. Its roof was sagging, and several of the boards on its walls were missing, like broken teeth. It had the distinct look of a place that had been forgotten, a structure that had served its purpose and been left to the wind and the dust. An abandoned stable, a place to be unseen, a place to be alone with the vast, echoing emptiness that had just opened up inside of her. It was there she would go. It was the only door left. The door of the abandoned stable groaned shut, a long, mournful sound that sealed Charlotte away from the world. The abrupt transition from the searing, white-hot glare of the afternoon to the cool, cavernous dark was a physical blow. She leaned back against the rough wood, her eyes closed, and for the first time since leaving Kansas, she allowed her shoulders to slump. The rigid posture she had maintained through the train journey, the walk through town, and the final, brutal confrontation, finally collapsed. For a long moment, she did not move. She just breathed. The air was thick with the ghosts of its past, the dry, sweet scent of ancient hay, the sharp tang of long-gone horses, and the damp, earthy smell of decay. Thin shafts of late-afternoon sun pierced the gloom through cracks in the walls, illuminating a swirling, silent dance of dust motes. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the sounds of the town and her own racing heart. Here, in this forgotten place, there were no judging eyes, no whispers, no false promises. There was only the truth of her situation. She was destitute, disgraced, and utterly alone in a land that did not know her name. The single tear she had refused to shed at Silas Cruft's door finally escaped. It traced a hot, slow path through the grime on her cheek, a solitary drop of grief, but it was followed by no others. Her sorrow was too vast, too deep for weeping. It was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. Crying felt like a fire, hot and quick, but this was the slow, crushing pressure of deep water. Slowly, her eyes adjusted to the dimness. She could make out the shapes of empty stalls, their doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. A pile of rotting leather harnesses lay in one corner, and in the center of the earthen floor, a single wagon wheel leaned against a support beam, its spokes broken. Her gaze settled on a deep bed of loose straw in the farthest, darkest stall. It looked almost clean, protected from the worst of the elements by the remnants of a solid roof above. It would have to do. She moved with a weary, mechanical grace, her body aching from the journey and the tension. She gathered the loosest, cleanest-smelling straw, piling it into a thicker mound, patting it down to form a makeshift mattress. She would not think about tomorrow. She would not think about the trunk she had left behind, or the face of the young woman who was living the life that was supposed to have been hers. For now, there was only the singular, primal goal of surviving the night. The sun was setting. She could see the light in the cracks shifting from gold to a deep, bruised orange. Soon, the cold would come. She was just about to curl up on her pathetic bed when a shadow fell across the stable entrance, eclipsing the last of the dying light. Charlotte froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She shrank back into the darkness of the stall, trying to will herself invisible. A figure stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his form filling the doorway. He stood perfectly still for a moment, letting his own eyes adjust to the gloom. Then, a horse nickered softly from the stall nearest the door. It was a sound she hadn't registered before, a living presence in this tomb of forgotten things. The man made a low, soothing sound in his throat in response. He took a step inside, and the illusion of abandonment was shattered. This place was not forgotten. It was being used. His boots were heavy on the packed earth. He moved with a quiet confidence, not the stumbling gait of a drunkard seeking shelter, but the measured tread of a man on his own property. Charlotte held her breath, pressing herself against the rough-hewn planks of the stall. He stopped, his head turning, his senses clearly telling him he was not alone with his animal. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, devoid of alarm but laced with a dry, questioning tone. "You plan on sleeping next to my horse?" The question hung in the dusty air. It was not an accusation, but a simple, direct inquiry that laid the facts bare. She was a trespasser. He was the owner. She could not see his face in the shadows, only the outline of a strong jawline, a thick beard, and the brim of a worn hat. Slowly, she forced herself to stand. To cower would be to invite scorn. She stepped out of the stall, her hands clasped before her, her chin held high despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. He was silent for another long moment, studying her. The last vestiges of light from the open door caught the side of his face. He was not old, perhaps 40, with a face carved by sun and hardship. His beard was dark, shot through with threads of gray, and his eyes, as they settled on her, seemed impossibly deep, holding a quiet intensity that saw more than just a woman in a dusty dress. He took in her worn but well-made clothes, the way she stood with a ramrod straightness born of pride, not defiance, and the profound exhaustion etched around her eyes. This was Caleb Rourke, a name the townsfolk spoke with a mixture of respect and caution. He ran a horse ranch a few miles north, supplying mounts to the cavalry and anyone else who could meet his price. He'd ridden with the army himself, they said, in the wars, and had come to Dry Hollow seeking quiet. He mostly kept to himself, a man who seemed more comfortable with horses than with people. He finally moved, walking past her to the stall where his horse stood, a magnificent black gelding that shifted its weight and nudged his shoulder with its nose. He ran a hand down the animal's powerful neck, his movements gentle and sure. "This is private property," he stated, his back still to her. The words were flat, a simple declaration of fact. "I know," Charlotte replied, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I meant no harm. I will leave at first light." He turned, leaning his shoulder against the stall post, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "And go where?" The question was a sharp, unexpected jab. Where would she go? Back to the train station to beg for a ticket east? To the church to plead for charity? The humiliation of it all washed over her again. She had no answer. She simply stared at him, her silence a confession of her utter desperation. He seemed to weigh her silence, his gaze unwavering. He was not a man given to impulse. She could see the careful consideration in his eyes, the way he measured her, assessed the situation, and came to a decision. Most men would have told her to get out, to take her troubles elsewhere. They would have seen her as a nuisance or an opportunity. Caleb Rourke, however, seemed to see something else. Perhaps he recognized the look of someone whose world had been pulled out from under them. "There's a line shack," he said at last, his voice still a low baritone. "Behind my main house. It's empty. Got a cot and a stove." Charlotte blinked, Unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Sir." He pushed off from the post and walked towards the door, pausing to look back at her. He didn't soften his tone or offer a reassuring smile. His face remained a mask of stoic neutrality. "You can't stay here. The rats are as big as cats and the roof leaks. You can stay in the shack one night." The offer was delivered not with warmth, but with a stark, practical finality. It was not an invitation to friendship or a promise of salvation. It was a temporary solution to a problem, offered as plainly as a man might offer a bucket of water to a thirsty horse. One night, the boundary was clear. He was offering shelter, not entanglement. For Charlotte, who had been given nothing but a lie all day, this gruff, conditional kindness was overwhelming. The lump returned to her throat, but this time it was not just grief, but a painful, burgeoning gratitude. She could only nod, unable to trust her voice. "Come on, then," he said, turning and stepping out into the purple dusk. "It'll be full dark soon." She followed him out of the stable, leaving her pathetic nest of straw behind. The air had grown cool, and the sky was a deep, star-dusted indigo. He walked a few paces ahead of her, his long strides eating up the ground. They walked in silence, away from the faint lights of the town, their path lit only by a sliver of moon. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the distant yip of a coyote. She watched his back. He was a solid, imposing figure, a man who seemed as much a part of the harsh landscape as the scrub brush and the rocks. He asked no questions. He didn't ask her name, where she came from, or why a woman like her was seeking shelter in his stable. His silence was a gift, a space for her to exist without having to explain the wreckage of her life. His ranch was a dark shape against the horizon, a main house with a single lamp glowing in one window, and several smaller outbuildings. He led her not to the main house, but to a small, solitary log cabin that stood 100 yards away from it. He pushed the door open, revealing a sparse, clean interior. In the moonlight that streamed through the single window, she could see a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket, a small pot-bellied stove, a wooden crate for a table, and a bucket and basin on a stand. It was less than a room, but more than she could have hoped for. It was a haven. He stopped at the threshold, not entering. "There's water in the bucket, an apple in the crate. If you're hungry, the latch is good." He looked at her then, his deep-set eyes catching the moonlight. "One night," he repeated, the words a firm, final reminder. Charlotte found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. Thank you, Mr. Rourke." He gave a curt nod, a barely perceptible motion in the darkness, then turned and walked away toward the main house, leaving her alone on the doorstep of the small cabin. She watched until his form was swallowed by the shadows. She stepped inside, closing the door and sliding the thick wooden bolt into place. The sound of it clicking home was the first feeling of security she'd had all day. She sank down onto the edge of the cot, the rough wool of the blanket coarse beneath her fingers. The night outside was vast and silent, filled with the indifferent beauty of a million stars. But as Charlotte sat there in the borrowed safety of the cabin, the darkness that filled her was of a different kind, not of the sky, but of the soul. It was a darkness deeper and more absolute than the starless corners of the midnight world, a hollow place where hope had died. The cowboy had offered her shelter from the night, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was still utterly and completely lost. Charlotte awoke to a world made of gray light and silence. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The cot was hard beneath her, the air cool and unfamiliar. Then the memory of the previous day crashed down upon her, a physical weight that settled in her chest, the whitewashed house, the young wife, the long walk back to nowhere. She was in a stranger's cabin, a beneficiary of a gruff, conditional charity that expired with the rising of the sun. The one night had passed. A profound sense of dread coiled in her stomach, She had to face him. She had to leave. But to where the question was a vast, featureless plain with no road in sight. She sat up, pushing the coarse wool blanket aside. Her body ached, a deep, weary soreness that was more than muscle deep. But pride was a stubborn companion. She would not face her temporary benefactor looking like a waif. She used the water in the basin to wash her face and hands. The cold shock of it, a welcome distraction. She smoothed her dress as best she could and twisted her hair into a severe, tight knot at the nape of her neck. It was a gesture of control in a life that had spun utterly out of it. A sharp rap on the door made her jump. She took a steadying breath before sliding the bolt and pulling the door open. Caleb Rourke stood on the step, a tin mug of coffee in his hand. The morning sun was at his back, casting his tall frame in silhouette. He looked as solid and unyielding as he had the night before. His eyes, clear and direct in the morning light, assessed her quickly. "There's coffee on," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and breakfast, before you go." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a piece of his morning routine that would, for this one day, include her. She wanted to refuse, to say that his single night of shelter was more than enough. But the aroma of coffee reached her, rich and dark, and her stomach betrayed her with a low, traitorous growl. She hadn't eaten since a stale piece of bread on the train yesterday. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. She followed him to the main house. The short walk across the hard-packed yard felt like crossing a great distance. His home, like the man himself, was built of sturdy, unadorned logs, chinked neatly with clay. It was a fortress of solitude. He held the door for her, and she stepped into his kitchen. The room was surprisingly warm and filled with the comforting smells of frying bacon and baking cornbread. It was a simple space, but meticulously clean. A large, black cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface gleaming. A long table made of hand-planed pine planks stood in the center of the room, scrubbed to a pale, smooth finish. Tin plates and cups were stacked neatly on an open shelf. There were no curtains on the window, no pictures on the walls, no feminine touches whatsoever. It was the kitchen of a man who lived alone and valued order over ornament. Yet there was an undeniable coziness to it, a sense of a life, however solitary, being lived with intention. He gestured to the table, and she sat, feeling terribly out of place. He moved about the kitchen with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, plating up thick slices of cured bacon and golden squares of cornbread beside 2 fried eggs. He set a plate in front of her, filled a second tin mug with coffee, and sat down opposite her. They ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable quiet, but a dense, thoughtful one. Charlotte focused on her plate, the simple, hearty food a balm to her empty stomach. It was the first true kindness she had received since arriving in this harsh land, and it felt both wonderful and dangerous. Kindness could make you soft, and she could not afford to be soft. They said very little, but their eyes did not avoid each other. Across the table, she watched his hands. They were large, calloused, and scarred. The hands of a man who worked hard and knew his way around horses and leather and wood. He ate with the same deliberate purpose he did everything else. He, in turn, watched her. He saw the way she held her fork, the quiet dignity in her posture, the deep, bruised sadness in her eyes that she tried so hard to conceal. He saw a woman who was adrift, but not broken. When they were finished, he rose and took their plates to the wash basin. The finality of the act was clear. The meal was over. Her time was up. Charlotte clasped her hands in her lap to still their trembling. Now was the moment. She had to speak. "Mr. Rourke," she began, her voice gaining strength as she went on. "I am in your debt, for the shelter and for the meal." He continued washing the plates, his back to her. "No debt?" "Yes," she insisted. "I would ask for one more thing, not charity." she added quickly, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "I need to find work. It may take a day or two. If you would allow me to stay in the cabin for just a little longer, I would find a way to repay you. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend." Her voice trailed off. She sounded like she was begging, and she hated it. He stopped his work, placing a wet plate carefully on the drying rack. He turned, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his deep-set eyes seeming to probe right through her carefully constructed composure. She thought he would say no. She braced herself for it. Instead of speaking, he walked to the door and gestured with his head for her to follow. He led her past the main house to a long, low-roofed shed that leaned against the far side of the barn. He slid back the heavy wooden door, revealing an interior crammed with the casualties of his trade. The shed was filled with the rich, earthy scent of leather, piles of it. Broken saddles were stacked in one corner, their seats split, their stirrup leathers frayed. Coils of reins and harnesses, their stitching snapped, hung from wooden pegs. It was a graveyard of damaged equipment, waiting for repair or disposal. Caleb gestured to the chaotic pile with a sweep of his hand. His gaze met hers, and there was a challenge in it. "If you know how to stitch leather," he said, leaving the sentence hanging in the air between them. A flicker of something not quite hope, but a spark of purpose ignited in Charlotte's chest. Her father had been a cobbler, a quiet man who had believed that a person's worth could be measured in the skill of their hands. From the time she was a girl, she had sat at his side, learning the trade. She knew the feel of a sharp awl, the precise tension of a saddle stitch, the patient art of bringing worn, broken things back to life. It was a skill she hadn't used in years, but one that was as ingrained in her as breathing. "I do," she said, her voice clear and firm. He nodded once, a flicker of something like surprise in his eyes. He rummaged through a cluttered wooden box and produced an awl, a spool of heavy waxed thread, and a set of gleaming needles. He handed them to her. The tools felt solid and familiar in her palm. "The shed is yours," he said. "Pay for your keep." And with that, he turned and left her there. Charlotte did not hesitate. She dragged a sturdy wooden crate to the doorway for light and a place to sit. She selected the least damaged saddle first, a simple stock saddle with a tear along the seat seam. She ran her fingers over the worn leather, assessing the damage. Her hands remembered the work. With the awl, she pierced a new line of holes, her movements sure and even. She threaded a needle, waxed the thread against a block of beeswax for strength and waterproofing, and began to sew. The rhythm of the work was a meditation. Push the needle through, pull the thread taut, lock the stitch, push, pull, lock. The simple, repetitive motion soothed the frantic chaos in her mind. Each perfect stitch was a small victory, a tiny piece of order she could impose on a world that had offered her none. She was not a jilted bride. She was not a charity case. Here, in this dusty shed, with these broken things, she was a craftswoman. She was useful. She worked through the day, stopping only to stretch her stiff back. The sun climbed high in the sky, and the shed grew warm. She focused only on the task at hand, on the clean, strong line of her stitches, on the way the torn leather drew together under her expert hands, becoming whole and strong again. By late afternoon, the first saddle was finished. It seemed stronger than the original. She set it aside and immediately picked up another. Caleb did not hover. He went about his own work, breaking a young colt in the round pen, mucking out the stalls, his powerful form a constant, distant presence. But she knew he was aware of her. She would sometimes glance up and find him watching from the fence line, his expression unreadable, before he would turn back to his own tasks. He didn't offer praise or criticism. He simply observed. He did not ask her a single question about her past. He didn't ask her name, what had brought her to Dry Hollow, or why she had ended up in his stable. His silence was a form of respect, a quiet acknowledgement that her history was her own. He gave her space, and in doing so, he gave her a chance to breathe. But as the days fell into a quiet routine, a silent breakfast, a long day of work in the shed, a simple supper he would leave for her on the cabin step, she began to notice things about him. There were moments when he stood looking out at the vast, empty horizon as the sun went down, that a profound loneliness seemed to settle over him, a shadow as long and deep as the one stretching across the plains. Sometimes, in the middle of a shared silence, his gaze would turn inward, and she would see a flicker of an old, deep pain in his eyes, a sorrow he kept locked away behind his stoic facade. He was a man with his own ghosts, his own carefully guarded history. She would sit in the shed, pulling a stitch tight, and feel his eyes on her from across the yard. And in those long, quiet moments, as the silence stretched between the man who asked no questions and the woman who offered no answers, a silent conversation took place. His gaze would hold hers for a beat too long, and in its depths, she saw an unspoken acknowledgement, a truth that needed no words. His eyes said, "I don't know your secrets, but I know what it is to have them. I have them too." The rain came without warning, a sudden, violent shift in the world's mood. One moment, the sky was a sheet of dull, indifferent gray. The next, it was weeping. It was not a gentle shower, but a cold, determined autumn rain that fell in hard, slanted lines, turning the dusty yard into a slick, churning sea of mud. It hammered on the roof of the shed where Charlotte worked, a relentless drumming that drowned out all other sound and seemed to penetrate the very wood, chilling the air within. For a week, she had kept to the rhythm, awaken in the cabin, share a silent breakfast at Caleb's table, work in the shed until her fingers were stiff and her back ached, and then retreat to her solitude with the supper he left for her. The boundary was clear and respected. The main house was his, the cabin hers, and the shed their shared, neutral ground. The arrangement was functional, stark, and suited them both. But the rain changed everything. By late afternoon, the path between the house and the cabin was a river of muck. A cold wind whipped the water into a frenzy, driving it through the very cracks of the shed's walls. Charlotte shivered, pulling her shawl tighter, her fingers too numb to properly grip the awl. She could not imagine Caleb venturing out in this deluge to bring her a plate of food, nor could she imagine the food surviving the journey if he did. The thought of a cold, wet supper or no supper at all was as bleak as the sky outside. As dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, the door to the shed slid open. Caleb stood there, water streaming from the brim of his hat, his oilskin coat glistening in the gloom. "Enough for today," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the rain. "You'll catch your death in here." She stood, rubbing her numb fingers. "It's a fierce one." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the neat pile of repaired saddles and harnesses. She had finished a testament to her week of tireless labor. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he looked at her, then out at the storm. "No sense in eating cold," he stated. It wasn't an invitation so much as a logical conclusion. "The fire's lit in the house. Come inside." She hesitated for only a moment. To refuse would be a foolish sort of pride. She nodded, setting her tools down carefully on the workbench before following him out into the maelstrom. He led the way, his broad back a shield against the worst of the wind, his long strides splashing through the mud. By the time they reached the shelter of his porch, she was soaked through, her dress clinging to her, her hair plastered to her scalp. Inside, the warmth was a physical embrace. A fire blazed in the stone hearth at the far end of the main room, casting a flickering golden light over the simple wooden furniture. It was the first time she had been in this part of his house, a space that was both a kitchen and a living area. It was as sparse and orderly as the rest of his domain, but the fire gave it life, made it feel like a refuge. "There's a blanket on the chest," he said, shrugging out of his wet coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Get yourself dry." She found the thick wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, huddling near the hearth, letting the heat seep into her chilled bones. He moved to the kitchen area, lighting a second lamp that pushed back the shadows. She watched as he opened a small pantry. The contents were predictable sacks of cornmeal and beans, a slab of bacon, tins of coffee, the diet of a man alone. An impulse, born of the shared shelter and the simple domesticity of the moment, moved her to speak. "Mr. Rourke," she began, her voice quiet but clear over the crackle of the flames. "If you would trust me with your provisions, I can make a proper supper, a hot stew." He stopped, turning to look at her. His expression was, as usual, difficult to read. He was a man who held his thoughts close, but after a moment of consideration, he gave a curt nod. "The pots are there," he said, gesturing to a hook beside the stove. The unspoken permission was a bridge between them. She shed the wet blanket, hanging it over a chair to dry, and moved to the kitchen. A silent, unconscious partnership formed. As she located the beans and a piece of salt pork, he filled a large kettle with water from the pump and set it on the stove to heat, while she chopped the pork and a precious, solitary onion she found in a bin. He measured out the cornmeal for a batch of cornbread. They moved around each other in the small space with a quiet, efficient grace, their tasks dovetailing without the need for words. The kitchen filled with new sounds, mingling with the storm outside, the sizzle of pork in the cast-iron pot, the whisk of a fork in the cornbread batter, the steady, comforting rhythm of work. For Charlotte, the simple act of cooking, of creating nourishment and warmth, was a reclamation of a part of herself she thought had been lost. They sat at the long pine table as the bean stew simmered, filling the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. The rain still lashed against the window panes, but inside, their small world was warm and bright. When the food was ready, she ladled the thick stew into 2 tin bowls and sliced the golden cornbread. He poured 2 mugs of coffee. They ate, as they always did, in silence. But this silence was different. It was not the silence of strangers sharing a table out of necessity, but something softer, more comfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who had created a small pocket of peace together against the fury of the storm. The food was simple, but it was hot and filling, and it tasted of shared effort. Charlotte found herself watching him. In the flickering firelight, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He was staring into the flames, his meal forgotten for a moment, his thoughts clearly a long way away. The shadows danced in the deep hollows of his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "This house," he began, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "It was built for 2 people." Charlotte stilled, her spoon halfway to her lips. She did not speak, did not move, knowing instinctively that this was a rare and fragile moment. To interrupt would be to shatter it. He took a slow breath. "My wife. Her name was Eleanor." The name fell into the quiet room, a name that had clearly not been spoken aloud in a very long time. "We came out here from Ohio, bought this land, built this place with our own hands. She was not made for this country. It was too hard, too empty. But she tried. Lord, how she tried." He picked up his coffee mug, holding it in both hands as if for warmth, though the room was plenty warm. It was the fever, in the winter of '72. It came on fast. The doctor was a day's ride away, and by the time he got here, he trailed off, shaking his head slightly, not in denial, but in weary remembrance. 1 week, that's all it took, from the first shiver to the last breath. 1 week. He fell silent. The only sounds were the hiss of the rain and the soft crackle of the logs in the hearth. He had not told a story of love or laughter, only of loss. He had stated the facts of his life's great tragedy with the same stark, unadorned simplicity he did everything else. He wasn't asking for pity. He was simply opening a door into his past, just a crack, letting her see the vast, empty room that lay within. Charlotte's own heart ached, not just for him, but with the resonance of her own unspoken griefs. She thought of the letters from Silas Croft, of the promise they had held, a promise that had proven to be a lie. But her thoughts went deeper, to an older, more profound promise that had been broken long before. She set her spoon down gently in her bowl. When she spoke, her voice was a near whisper, an echo of his own quiet pain. "I, too," she said, looking not at him, but at her own hands, clasped on the table. "I had a person who once promised forever." The words hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge of shared sorrow. It was a confession, as bare and as honest as his own. She did not offer details. He did not ask for them. He didn't need to. In that moment, they understood each other perfectly. They were two people marked by broken promises, two solitary souls who knew the profound weight of what is lost and can never be reclaimed. He finally raised his eyes from the fire and looked at her. He gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. When the meal was over, they cleared the plates in the same quiet, collaborative rhythm as before. The storm outside had begun to abate, its fury lessening to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The time had come for her to retreat to her cabin. But as she reached for the blanket to wrap around herself for the journey back, Caleb rose from the table. He walked to the wood pile by the hearth, selected 2 thick seasoned logs, and carefully placed them on the embers of the fire. The logs caught quickly, sending a cascade of bright orange sparks up the chimney and flooding the room with a sudden, intense wave of light and warmth. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the fresh flames. "The rain will pass by morning," he said. "No need to go out in it again tonight. You can take the cot in the spare room." Charlotte looked from his face to the blazing fire, and she felt the warmth spread through her. A heat that had nothing to do with the flames. It was the warmth of a small, unspoken kindness, the cold that had taken root in her bones on the day she arrived in Dry Hollow. A deep, internal chill that had nothing to do with the weather began, finally, to recede. She was still a stranger in a harsh land, her future a terrifying unknown, but for the first time, in this small cabin, in the company of this quiet, wounded man, she did not feel entirely alone. The rain gave way to a long, golden stretch of autumn. The season turned, and with it, the quiet arrangement at the Rourke Ranch settled into a kind of permanence. The one night in the line shack became a week, and the week, after the storm, became a month in the spare room of the main house. The boundary between employer and employee, benefactor and beneficiary, began to blur, replaced by the subtle, unspoken rhythm of 2 solitary people sharing a life. Charlotte's work expanded beyond the endless pile of broken tack in the shed. She took it upon herself to mend the frayed cuffs on Caleb's shirts, the stitches neat and almost invisible. She found a patch of earth behind the cabin, cleared it of stones, and, using seeds she purchased with the small wage Caleb insisted on paying her, began a small, hopeful garden of late-season greens. The house, once merely a clean, Spartan shelter, began to feel like a home. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap until the pine boards gleamed. And one day, using a length of spare calico, she even sewed a pair of simple curtains for the kitchen window. Caleb never commented on these small changes, but he noticed them. He would find his favorite shirt repaired and folded on his bed, or see the splash of green from the new curtains as he crossed the yard, and a quiet stillness would come over his features. They still ate most of their meals in a comfortable silence, but it was a silence now filled with shared understanding. They spoke of the weather, of a difficult colt, of the price of feed. They never spoke of the past. It was a locked room they had both tacitly agreed to leave undisturbed. But their quiet world could not remain an island forever. The ranch needed supplies, and the dwindling sacks of flour and coffee in the pantry made a trip to Dry Hollow unavoidable. "We'll need to go to town tomorrow," Caleb announced one evening, his voice flat. He disliked the town, and usually sent a boy from a neighboring farm for his necessities. But the order was large, and now he was not just providing for himself. Charlotte felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The town was a place of humiliation, the site of her life's greatest shame, but she nodded. "I'll make a list." The next morning, they rode in on the buckboard wagon, Caleb handling the reins with his usual quiet competence, Charlotte sitting straight-backed on the bench beside him. As they drew near, the raw, unpainted buildings of Dry Hollow seemed to rise from the plains like monuments to her folly. She steeled herself, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As the wagon rolled down the main street, heads turned, conversations on porches paused, faces appeared in windows. The sight of the reclusive Caleb Rourke with a woman at his side was an event, a piece of news to be dissected and discussed over fence posts and store counters for weeks to come. Their first stop was the Mercantile, Henderson's general store, a cavern of a building that smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. The moment they stepped inside, the low hum of conversation among the half-dozen customers faltered and died. An abrupt, heavy silence fell over the room. Mr. Henderson, a portly man with a fringe of gray hair, stopped weighing a sack of beans and stared, his mouth slightly agape. Caleb seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it. He strode to the counter and handed his list to the storekeeper. "Henderson." "Rourke," the man replied, his eyes flicking from Caleb to Charlotte and back again. "Be with you in a moment." While Caleb waited, Charlotte moved to the dry goods section, feigning an interest in the bolts of fabric. She could feel the stares on her back, hot and prickling. And then the whispers began. They were low, meant to be unheard, but in the charged silence of the store, they carried like shouts. "The one staying out at his place just showed up one day," a woman in a severe black bonnet murmured to her companion. "Came on the train. I heard," the other replied, her voice sharp. "Looking for a husband. They say aimed for Silas Croft first, but he was already spoken for." A dry, cruel little laugh followed. Charlotte's hands tightened on a bolt of rough cotton. She kept her eyes fixed on the fabric, her face a mask of calm neutrality. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. But the reality of it, the sheer, unthinking cruelty of it, was a fresh wound. They were stripping her of her story, replacing it with a sordid, ugly fiction of their own making. In their eyes, she was not a woman deceived, but a woman of loose morals, a desperate spinster who had latched onto the first man who would have her. She moved on to the shelves of threads and needles, and another snippet of conversation drifted over. Two men, leaning against a barrel of nails, were speaking in low tones, their eyes on Caleb's back. Always knew Rourke was a strange one. Keeps to himself. Now this must have a taste for cast-offs. Caleb turned his head then, just a fraction, and his cold, steady gaze fell upon the two men. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The men immediately found the floorboards intensely interesting, their conversation ceasing abruptly. He looked over at Charlotte, a silent question in his eyes. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, letting him know she was all right. His quiet act of defense was a balm on the sting of the whispers. They finished their business and left, the silence of the store pressing in on them as the door swung shut. They did not speak of it as they loaded their supplies into the wagon. To speak of it would be to give the gossip power, to let it into the sanctuary of their quiet life. But the town was not finished with her. As they passed the church, a simple white building with a modest steeple, the Sunday service was letting out. Families spilled into the churchyard, the men in dark suits, the women in their best dresses and bonnets, their children scrubbed and well-behaved. It was the heart of the community, the seat of its moral judgment, and it was there that Charlotte saw her. Standing beside a tall, thick-set man with a self-satisfied expression was the young woman from Silas Croft's porch, Sarah. Caleb had told her the name was Sarah Croft. She looked different now, not the frightened, weary girl in a faded house dress, but a proper townswoman in a blue dress, a bonnet tied neatly under her chin. Her husband, Silas, had his hand on the small of her back, a proprietary gesture. Seeing him for the first time was like looking at a ghost. This was the man whose neat, deliberate script had lured her across the country to her own destruction. The other women of the congregation were staring at Charlotte, whispering behind their gloved hands, their faces a mixture of pious disapproval and hungry curiosity. But Sarah Croft was not whispering. She was not looking at her with mere curiosity. Her gaze met Charlotte's across the churchyard, and it was as cold and hard as a winter river. There was no pity in her eyes, no shared understanding of their strange, intersecting fates. The look she gave Charlotte was something else entirely. It was sharp, pointed, and filled with a silent, urgent intensity. It was not the stare of a rival, or of a woman gloating over her victory. It was a warning, a cold dread, entirely different from the sting of the gossip, trickled down Charlotte's spine. The whispers in the store were petty and cruel, but this was something deeper, more menacing. Sarah Croft, the one other person in this town who knew the truth of why Charlotte had come to Dry Hollow, was looking at her not as a victim, but as a threat. The warning was clear and unmistakable. Asterisk, stay silent, stay away, do not make trouble. Charlotte broke the gaze first, turning her head and looking straight ahead as the wagon rolled past. The image of the young wife's hard, fearful eyes was burned into her mind. The ride back to the ranch was as silent as the ride in, but the quality of the silence had changed. Before, it had been a space of comfort. Now, it was filled with the echoes of the town's malice and the chilling enigma of that final, silent confrontation. The ranch, when it came into view, looked more like a fortress than ever, a refuge from a hostile world. That evening, Charlotte went back to her work. She picked up a heavy leather rifle scabbard, its seam split, and began the steady, rhythmic work of mending. Push the needle through, pull the thread taut, lock the stitch. She continued to work, to cook, to mend, to build a small, quiet life in the shelter of Caleb Rourke's protection. But as her hands moved with practiced skill, her mind was racing. The rumors she could endure, the judgment she could ignore. But the warning in Sarah Croft's eyes was a different matter. It was a dark, unsettling premonition, a sign that the past was not finished with her yet. The memory of the town's hostile whispers and Sarah Croft's warning stare settled over the ranch like a low-lying fog, a chill that lingered even in the warmth of the autumn sun. The trip had changed something. The world outside had intruded, reminding them both that their quiet sanctuary was not a fortress, but a fragile truce with a past that was not yet buried. They spoke even less in the days that followed, but the silence between them was different now. It was heavier, freighted with the unspoken questions and shared anxieties that the visit to Dry Hollow had stirred up. Charlotte worked with a fierce, focused intensity, her needle flying through the thick leather as if each stitch could somehow mend the frayed edges of her own peace of mind. Caleb was a more distant figure, often riding out to the far edges of his property and not returning until long after dusk, his face set in a grim, stony mask. She knew he was wrestling with his own demons, the same ones that kept him isolated from the world. It was on one of these late afternoons, with the sun casting long, golden shadows across the yard, that the unspoken tension finally broke. They were in the shed, sorting through a recent acquisition, a pile of water-damaged tack he had bought for a pittance from a freight wagon that had overturned in the river. The leather was stiff and stained, and the air was thick with the musty smell of river mud and decay. Charlotte was working a piece of brittle leather with saddle soap, her hands moving in a slow, circular motion, trying to coax some life back into it. Caleb was on the other side of the workbench, testing the rusted buckles of a harness. He stopped, his hands stilling on a mildewed strap. He was staring at an old, leather-bound ledger that had been part of the ruined lot. He picked it up, the cover creaking in protest. He flipped through a few of the water-warped pages, his expression grim. Then he paused, his gaze fixed on a particular entry. Without a word, he tore the page from the book. The sound of the ripping paper was startlingly loud in the quiet shed. He smoothed the crumpled sheet on the workbench and pushed it across the scarred wood toward her. Charlotte wiped her soapy hands on her apron and picked it up. The handwriting was an elegant, forward-slanting script, but the words it spelled out were ugly. It was a list of debts, names of local ranchers and homesteaders beside figures that made her breath catch. Beside each name was a notation, asterisk, foreclosed. Asterisk, asterisk, collected in kind. Asterisk, or simply, asterisk, settled. Asterisk. The final entry on the page was for a larger sum. Against the name Caleb Rourke, the debt was for 160 acres of bottomland, this very ranch. But it wasn't the debt that made her blood run cold. It was the name written at the top of the page in a confident, possessive scrawl, asterisk, accounts for collection. A. Harrow, asterisk. Harrow owns this town, Caleb said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He hadn't been looking at the paper. He'd been watching her face as she read it. Owns the bank. Owns the freight company. Holds the paper on half the ranches in this county. When a man can't pay, Harrow takes his land, his cattle, or his pride. He reached out and tapped a finger on the list of names. These men, I knew them. Watched them lose everything. He finally lifted his gaze from the paper to meet hers, and the look in his eyes was raw, a pain so old and deep it seemed carved into his soul. I was his man, he said, the words coming out rough, as if torn from his throat. Before I bought this place, before Eleanor, I rode for him. When a debt came due, Harrow sent me. I was the one who delivered the notice, the one who stood by while they loaded up a man's possessions. I settled the accounts. The confession hung in the dusty, sunlit air between them. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the explanation for his solitude, for the town's wary respect, for the shadows she saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He had not just been a soldier, he had been an enforcer, the hard face of a cruel and predatory power. He had been complicit in the very kind of ruin that had brought her to his door. Charlotte looked down at the paper, at the list of broken men, at Caleb's own name, a captive among them. She could feel the shame radiating from him, a palpable heat. He was expecting her to recoil, to judge him, to see him now as the other men in town must see him as Harrow's man. Slowly, she folded the paper, creasing it carefully along its original lines. She pushed it back across the table. Then, she reached out. Her movement was deliberate, unhurried. She laid her hand on his forearm. His muscles were rigid beneath her touch, coiled as tight as a spring. His arm was thick and powerful, the arm of a man who could easily break another. But under her palm, she felt a slight tremor. She said nothing. Words were useless here. Judgment was a luxury she couldn't afford and had no right to. What could she say that his past didn't matter? It did. It was written all over him. But what she could offer was this simple, silent gesture, a touch that said, asterisk. I am still here. This does not change that. He looked down at her small hand on his weathered, scarred arm, then slowly lifted his gaze to her face. The hardness in his eyes seemed to fracture, just for a moment, revealing the profound vulnerability beneath. He gave a single, sharp nod, his throat working, and then he turned away, picking up a broken bridle and examining it with an intensity it did not deserve. His silence a shield. He pulled back around himself. That night, The air on the porch was cool and clear. A great silver disk of a moon was rising over the dark silhouette of the distant mesas, washing the landscape in a pale, ethereal light. The world seemed stripped down to its essential elements, earth, sky, and the vast, profound silence that held them both. They had eaten their supper in a silence even deeper than usual. Now they sat in the two rocking chairs, a habit that had become their evening ritual. The gentle creak of the runners, the only sound between them. Caleb's confession had changed the space between them. A wall had come down, and in its place was a raw, uncertain openness. It was Charlotte who finally spoke, her voice soft in the stillness, not much louder than the chirping of the crickets. She was not looking at him, but out at the moonlit plains, at the endless stretch of land and sky. "I was with child once." The words fell into the night, simple, devastating, and utterly bare. The creaking of Caleb's rocker stopped. He did not speak, did not move, granting her the same respectful silence she had given him that afternoon. "It was before," she continued, her voice steady, stripped of all self-pity. "Before I came west, before all this, the father, he was a good man, or so I believed. He was the one who promised forever." She paused, the memory a physical ache in her chest. "The baby. I lost it, not far along. A fever, like your Eleanor. After that, the promise seemed to wither. He said we were too young, that it was a sign. He married another girl 6 months later, a girl with a proper dowry." She finally turned her head to look at him. His face was half in shadow, half in moonlight. His expression impossible to read, but his attention was entirely on her. She had given him her deepest secret, the true source of the wound she carried. It was not just the humiliation of Silas Croft's lie, it was the wreckage of a much greater betrayal, a loss of a child, a love, and a future, all at once. Caleb looked at her for a long, silent moment. The moonlight caught the silver in his beard, the deep lines around his eyes. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not say he was sorry. He simply held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of profound, shared understanding. He knew loss. He knew betrayal. He knew what it was to have the life you planned snatched away from you. He gave a slow, gentle nod. It was a gesture of absolute acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement of her pain that was more comforting than any words could ever be. A small, sad smile touched Charlotte's lips. The air between them felt clean, honest. The biggest ghosts had been brought out into the moonlight. She looked away, back at the vast, uncaring beauty of the night sky, and whispered, more to herself than to him, one secret each. It was a question and a statement all at once, an offering, a treaty, a recognition that they were now on equal footing. Two wounded souls who had seen the ugliest truths in each other and had not turned away. She heard him shift in his chair. She felt his gaze on her. "I'll start," he said. His voice was a low rumble in the darkness, but it was not the sound of confession. It was the sound of a promise that the story he had started that afternoon was not over. It was the sound of a man opening a door, not just a crack, but all the way, and inviting her to step inside. The notice was nailed to the door of the blacksmith's shop, a single sheet of paper that held the power to unmake a world. Caleb saw it first when he rode in for a length of chain, and when he returned to the ranch. He carried the news not in his hands, but in the grim, shuttered look on his face. "Harrow's making his move," he said, standing in the doorway of the shed where Charlotte was oiling a newly repaired saddle. "He's got the town council calling a meeting, at the chapel, of all places." He explained the purpose in blunt, clipped sentences. A new mining concern, backed by capital from the east, wanted to buy the section of unincorporated land to the north of town for exploratory digging. The land was mostly rock and scrub, useless for grazing, but it was bordered on one side by Caleb's own property. The deal, brokered by Harrow, promised jobs, a rail spur, and prosperity for Dry Hollow. A town hungry for a future was unlikely to refuse. "They won't just be digging," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "They'll be blasting, damming the creek, tearing the heart out of it." He turned and stared out at the northern ridge, a long, low line against the pale blue sky. "It's where I buried her, up in that small grove of cottonwoods. It's the only place the ground was soft enough to dig." Charlotte stopped her work, the scent of linseed oil suddenly sharp and cloying. She understood now. This wasn't about property lines or mining rights. It was a desecration. Harrow was not just trying to buy land, he was trying to erase the last, sacred piece of Caleb's past. "The meeting is Thursday night," he said, his back still to her. "I have to be there." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Asterisk, will you come? Asterisk. To go with him would be to publicly align herself with the town's outcast, to step back into the very den of judgment she had so recently fled. To stay behind would be to leave him to face it alone. "I will need to press my good dress," she said quietly. It was all the answer he needed. He gave a single, curt nod, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction, and walked away. On Thursday evening, they rode into town not as a man and his hired help, but as allies heading into battle. Caleb had put on a clean, dark shirt, and his beard was neatly trimmed. He looked less like a recluse and more like the formidable man he was. Charlotte wore her gray traveling dress, the one she had arrived in, but now it was meticulously pressed, her hair coiled in a tight, severe bun. They were armed not with weapons, but with a shared, quiet dignity. The chapel was already full when they arrived, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, kerosene, and anticipation. Every pew was packed with the ranchers, merchants, and wives of Dry Hollow. As Caleb and Charlotte stepped through the door, a wave of silence rolled through the congregation. All heads turned, and 100 pairs of eyes fixed on them, a collective stare of curiosity, disapproval, and suspicion. They ignored it. Caleb led the way to an empty space at the end of a rear pew, his large frame a bulwark against the stairs. Charlotte sat beside him, her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the plain wooden cross that hung above the pulpit. She could feel the whispers starting up around them, a sibilant, rustling sound like dry leaves skittering across a gravestone. The meeting was called to order by Reverend Miller, a man whose timid nature seemed ill-suited to the task of containing the strong wills in the room. He quickly ceded the floor to the architect of the evening's business, Mr. Harrow. Harrow was a man who wore his prosperity like a suit of armor, dressed in a fine Eastern suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He exuded an aura of smooth, unassailable confidence. He spoke not of mines and money, but of progress. He painted a glorious picture of Dry Hollow's future, a bustling town, a schoolhouse with a full-time teacher, new businesses, a direct link to the world. He was a master salesman, wrapping his greed in the pretty paper of community benefit. When he finished, a smattering of applause broke out. The faces around Charlotte were eager, hopeful. Harrow was offering them a way out of the slow, grinding poverty of the frontier. "Are there any objections?" Reverend Miller asked, his voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. Caleb Rourke stood up. His rising was a slow, deliberate act that seemed to suck all the air from the room. He did not go to the pulpit. He stood where he was, a towering, solitary figure in the back of the chapel. He was not a man of pretty words, and he did not try to be. "That land is not for sale," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the room. He did not look at Harrow. He looked at the faces of the men he had known for years. Some of you remember my wife, Eleanor. A few of the older ranchers nodded, their faces somber. "She's buried up there," Caleb continued, his voice growing rough with an emotion he could not entirely suppress. "On the North Ridge, I built this ranch for her, and that land is where she rests. It's all I have left of her. It is not for sale. Not for any price. He said nothing more. He simply stood there, his statement a stark, immovable fact. Harrow let out a small, condescending sigh, stepping forward with the air of a patient teacher correcting a slow student. "Mr. Rourke," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we all respect your loss, but we cannot let private sentiment stand in the way of prosperity for the entire community. It is a piece of unused, unproductive land. A memorial can be moved. Progress, however, cannot." "It is not a memorial," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "It is a grave, and it will not be disturbed." The whispers around Charlotte grew louder, more pointed. It was one thing to challenge Harrow's business, but it was another to stand with Caleb Rourke, the man who had once been Harrow's enforcer, the man who now lived in open defiance of the town's social order, and their judgment, unable to find a purchase on Caleb's stony resolve, turned to the easier target. "He's not thinking right, bringing asterisk her asterisk here." What right does a woman like that have to be in a church, let alone a town meeting? Brazen, sitting there beside him as if she has a place. The words were sharp little barbs, and they found their mark. They were meant to diminish him by diminishing her, to invalidate his argument by invalidating her presence. Charlotte felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks. She had endured their gossip in the store, their stares on the street, but here, in this house of God, their hypocrisy was a stench in the air. She saw Silas Croft a few pews ahead, his face impassive. Beside him, Sarah Croft sat rigid, her eyes fixed on her own hands, refusing to look back. She was a willing participant in the town's silent condemnation. Caleb heard the whispers. She felt the muscles in his arm tense beside her. He was about to turn, to unleash the cold fury she knew he possessed. But before he could, Charlotte placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea for him to stop. Then she stood up. Her movement was quiet, but it was so unexpected that the whispers faltered and died. She did not look like a brazen woman. She looked small and severe in her plain gray dress, her face pale in the lamplight. She stood beside Caleb, but she was not hiding behind him. She turned her head and looked directly at the women who had been whispering, her gaze moving from one face to the next. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she held their eyes. "You whisper about what right I have to be here," she said, her voice starting as a low, trembling thing but gaining strength with every word. "You are right. I have no land here. I have no husband. I have no standing in this town." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she turned her gaze to the front of the church, to the pulpit and the cross, though her words were meant for everyone. But the woman who arrives alone on a train, carrying nothing but a broken promise, has a soul, she declared, her voice ringing with a clarity that stunned the room into absolute silence. The woman who is turned away from a man's door, with all her hopes turned to dust, has a soul. The woman rejected and scorned outside the very walls of a church. She has a soul, too. Her eyes swept the room, meeting the shocked and shamed faces of the congregation. "And that soul," she finished, her voice dropping but losing none of its power, "belongs to no one but herself. It does not belong to the men who judge her, nor the women who whisper about her. My right to be here is not granted by any of you. I stand here because my soul demands it, just as Mr. Rourke stands here for the soul of the woman he laid to rest on that hill." She sat down. The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence of shock, of shame, of grudging respect. She had not argued the law or the economics of the matter. She had held up a mirror to the soul of the town, and they had not liked the reflection. Harrow's face was a mask of cold fury. She had derailed his smooth presentation, changing the subject from progress and profit to morality and souls. Reverend Miller, looking flustered, cleared his throat. "Ahem. Well, a vote is required, all in favor of the proposal." Hands went up, but not as many as before. The promise of prosperity had been tarnished by the stain of their own hypocrisy. When the opposing votes were called, Caleb's hand was joined by a surprising number of the older ranchers, men who understood the sacredness of a final resting place. But it was not enough. The future, as Harrow had defined it, won the day. The proposal passed. As the meeting broke up, Caleb and Charlotte rose and walked toward the door. No one met their eyes. The crowd parted for them, a silent, grudging admission of their moral defeat. They stepped out into the cool, dark night. The stars were brilliant in the black sky, cold and distant and clean. They had lost the vote. The bulldozers and the blasting powder would come. But as they walked to the wagon, they walked together. No longer just two solitary people sharing a roof, but two souls who had stood together and spoken their truth in a town that did not want to hear it. And in that shared defiant stand, they had won a victory far more important than a piece of land. The defeat at the chapel settled into the bones of the ranch, a quiet, gnawing ache. They had lost. The world, in the form of Harrow and his progress, was coming for the North Ridge, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. An unspoken melancholy fell over their small world. The work continued. The days followed their established rhythm, but a sense of borrowed time hung in the air. And then the sky turned to iron. The snow came a full month early, a shocking betrayal by a season that was supposed to have been gentle. It began not with soft, picturesque flakes, but with a hard, stinging sleet driven by a wind that screamed down from the mountains like a banshee. Within an hour, the world was gone, erased by a churning, blinding wall of white. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, a relentless, physical force, hammered at the log house, searching for any crack, any weakness. "The barn roof," Caleb said, his voice grim as he stared out the window into the maelstrom. "That south corner's been loose. This wind will take it." Before Charlotte could protest, he was pulling on his heavy oilskin coat and wrapping a scarf around the lower half of his face. He moved with a grim determination. A man heading out to fight a battle he knew he might not win. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice sharp over the howl of the wind. "Keep the fire high." Charlotte watched from the window, her heart a tight, cold knot in her chest. She saw him struggle toward the barn, his tall form bent against the gale, the snow swirling so thickly around him that he sometimes vanished from sight completely. He disappeared inside, and for a long, terrifying time, there was nothing but the white fury of the storm. Then she saw him again. He was on horseback now, astride his powerful black gelding, a coil of heavy rope slung over his shoulder. He was trying to get a line over the high main beam of the barn to secure the flapping section of roof. It was a desperate, dangerous task. The horse, though steady, was unnerved by the storm, its ears flat against its head, its body tense. She watched, her hands pressed against the cold glass of the window pane, as Caleb urged the horse closer to the barn wall for leverage. He stood in the stirrups, his body braced against the wind, and with a powerful heave, he threw the rope. It snaked up into the white chaos, but a savage gust caught it. Whipping it back, he recoiled, settling back into the saddle to regather the rope. It all happened in a single, horrifying instant. As he leaned to pick up the rope, a gust of wind, stronger than all the rest, hit the barn with the force of a battering ram. A large, unseen sheet of ice and snow sheared off the roof and crashed to the ground near the horse. The gelding, already on edge, screamed and reared violently. Caleb, caught off balance, was thrown. He didn't fall clear. He came down hard, his left shoulder and side slamming against the frozen, unyielding earth with a sickening thud. The horse scrambled for footing and bolted, disappearing into the blizzard. Caleb did not get up. For a moment, Charlotte was frozen, paralyzed by the horrific image. Then, a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, jolted her into action. She didn't think. She grabbed the heavy wool blanket from her bed, threw her own thin coat over her shoulders, and plunged out into the storm. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. The snow was a physical assault, blinding her, stinging her face with 1,000 icy needles. She fought her way toward the dark shape lying motionless by the barn, her boots sinking deep into the rapidly accumulating drifts. "Caleb," she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. He was conscious when she reached him, his teeth gritted against a pain that contorted his face. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. "Shoulder," he gasped, his breath coming in short, ragged puffs. "Can't move it." Getting him back to the house was a nightmare. He was a big man, a dead weight of agony. She half dragged, half carried him, her small frame straining with the effort. He leaned on her heavily, his right arm slung over her shoulders, his face pale and beaded with sweat despite the freezing cold. Every step was a battle against the wind, the snow, and his searing pain. By the time they stumbled back through the door and into the blessed warmth of the cabin, they were both gasping for breath, their clothes caked with snow. She helped him into the large wooden armchair by the fire, his face ashen, with gentle, careful movements. She cut away the sleeve of his coat and shirt. The sight of his shoulder made her stomach clench. It was already swollen, unnaturally misshapen, and a dark, angry bruise was beginning to bloom across the skin. It was dislocated, or broken, or both. For the next several days, the storm raged outside, sealing them in a small, isolated world of pain and quiet care. The house became a sick room. Charlotte moved with a quiet, tireless efficiency. She packed his shoulder with snow to keep the swelling down. She brewed willow bark tea for the pain and fever that set in. She learned to help him dress, to cut his food, to manage the simple tasks that his injury had made impossible. A strange, formal intimacy grew between them. Her hands were on him constantly, but her touch was always practical, clinical. She would help him sit up, her arm bracing his good side. She would wash the sweat from his brow with a cool cloth. She would change the poultice on his shoulder. But they did not touch otherwise. There were no gentle caresses, no comforting embraces. They maintained a careful, respectful distance, a space defined by his pain and her role as his caregiver. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the charged awareness of their forced proximity. He was a difficult patient, not because he complained he bore the pain with a stoic, infuriating silence, but because he hated being helpless. The frustration and anger radiated from him. He would try to get up on his own and fall back with a grunt of pain. He would stare into the fire for hours, his jaw tight, a prisoner in his own home, in his own body. On the third afternoon, the storm finally began to break. The wind died down to a low moan, and a pale, watery light began to filter through the windows, reflecting off the impossibly deep snow that had buried their world. The house was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Caleb had fallen into a fitful, pain-ridden sleep in the armchair. Charlotte sat in a straight-backed chair opposite him, mending one of his torn shirts, the simple, repetitive motion of the needle, a calming anchor in the long, tense hours. She thought he was still asleep when he spoke, his voice low and rough, slurred with exhaustion. His eyes remained closed. "I'm not afraid of dying," he whispered to the fire, to the room, to himself. "Been close enough to it before. In the war, out here, it's just a door you walk through." Charlotte's needle stilled in mid-stitch. She held her breath, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound that might break the fragile spell. This was the fever talking, perhaps, or the laudanum she'd given him for the pain. It was the man beneath the armor, the voice from the place where all his secrets were kept. He shifted, a low groan of pain escaping his lips. His face, in the flickering firelight, was a mask of raw vulnerability. The lines of hardship and grief seemed etched deeper than ever. "But I am afraid," he continued, his voice barely audible, "of not saying this, of walking through that door with this thing. Unsaid. Charlotte's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The small, warm room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick, charged with the weight of the moment. She waited, suspended in the silence, every part of her listening. He took a slow, ragged breath. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. His eyes remained closed, as if he could only speak this truth from the darkness behind his own eyelids. I don't want you to leave this house. The words were so simple, so quiet. They were not a declaration of passion or a poetic verse. They were a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the log walls around them. It was the most honest, most vulnerable thing he had ever said. It was not a plea, but a confession that she was no longer just a stray he had taken in, or a woman who mended his saddles. She had become a part of the foundation. Without her, the house would be empty again. The life he was living would be over. He said nothing more. His breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep. He had spoken his piece and retreated back into the silence. Charlotte did not move for a long time. She sat in the fading afternoon light, the needle still clutched in her fingers, the torn shirt forgotten in her lap. The storm was over. The world outside was a blank, white page, and inside the small, quiet house, a single, terrifying, and wondrous sentence had just been written upon it, changing everything. The snow did not retreat. It surrendered. For a week, it held the world in a state of pristine, silent siege. Then, slowly, the sun began to win. The melt was a messy, protracted affair. Water dripped from the eaves of the house and barn, a relentless, ticking clock marking the return of the world. The yard became a treacherous morass of mud and slush. The sharp, clean edges of the snowdrifts softened, slumped, and bled into the thawing earth. With the thaw came the slow, painful return of Caleb's strength. The dislocation had been severe, and though the worst of the pain had subsided, a deep, grinding ache remained, and his arm was still bound tightly to his chest in a sling Charlotte had fashioned from a clean flour sack. He was ambulatory now, pacing the confines of the house like a caged wolf, his frustration a constant, simmering presence. He was a man defined by physical capability, and being forced into idleness was a torment. His confession, spoken in the fevered twilight of the storm, lay between them, a precious, terrifying, and unspoken thing. Asterisk, I don't want you to leave this house. Asterisk. Neither of them had mentioned it since, but it had changed the air, altered the very light in the rooms. Charlotte no longer felt like a guest or an employee. She moved with a new, quiet sense of ownership, a feeling of belonging that was as terrifying as it was welcome. She had cared for him, and in doing so, had woven herself into the very fabric of his life. They were in the kitchen on a bright, cold morning 10 days after the storm had broken. The ground was still soft, but the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Charlotte was at the table, carefully cleaning and oiling the parts of his revolver, a task he could not manage with one hand. Caleb stood at the window, staring out at the muddy track that led to town, his good hand clenching and unclenching at his side. The fragile peace of their convalescence was over. The world was back, and with it, its threats. He was the first to see the rider. "Company," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. Charlotte looked up, her hand stilling on the cool, oiled metal of the cylinder. A lone horseman was picking his way carefully through the mud, heading directly for the house. He was not a neighbor. He rode with a sense of purpose, of official business. As he drew closer, she recognized him from the chapel Mr. Davies, a landowner with a parcel adjoining the town commons, a man known to be in Harrow's pocket. A cold dread settled in her stomach. The vote at the meeting had not been forgotten. It had only been delayed by the snow. Caleb did not move from the window. He simply watched the man approach, his face a granite mask. Davies reined in his horse at the porch, dismounted, and stepped up to the door. his boots making a squelching sound on the damp wood. He rapped twice, a sharp, impatient sound. Charlotte looked at Caleb, but he seemed frozen, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the rider, beyond the horizon. With a deep breath, she rose, wiped her hands on a cloth, and went to the door. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice even. She did not open the door wide, but stood squarely in the frame. Davies, a stout man with a florid face, looked momentarily surprised to be confronted by her. He quickly recovered, puffing out his chest. "I'm here to see Rourke," he said, his tone dismissive. "On behalf of the town council and the Arizona Mineral Consortium." "He's unwell," Charlotte replied, her voice firm. "His business is my business. What do you want?" Davies's eyes narrowed, but Caleb's voice cut in from behind her, heavy with resignation. "Let him in, Charlotte." She stepped aside, and Davies entered, bringing the chill of the morning in with him. He took in the scene, Caleb standing by the window, his arm in a sling, his face pale and drawn, the disassembled gun on the table, the woman who stood before him like a gatekeeper. A small, smug smile touched his lips. "Rourke," he began, dispensing with any pleasantries, "the council has finalized the sale of the northern section. As per the agreement, your lease on this parcel, which was contingent on the town's non-development of the adjacent land, is hereby terminated. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "This is the official notice." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. Vacate. 48 hours. It was a death sentence for the life they had just begun to build. Caleb did not even look at the paper. He just stared out the window, a long, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. He had fought, and he had lost. Now, the bill had come due. He was a man who understood the finality of things. "Leave the notice on the table," he said, his voice weary, utterly devoid of fight. Davies placed the paper on the edge of the table, well away from the oiled gun parts, and turned to go, his duty done. But Charlotte did not move from the doorway. She stood there, a small, unmovable obstacle. "He's not leaving," she said. Davies stopped, turning back with an expression of irritated disbelief. "Ma'am, that's not for you to say. The law is the law. He has to be out." "He is not leaving," she repeated, her voice gaining a hard, steely edge. "Because you have no claim on this land. This land does not belong to the town. It belongs to him." A humorless laugh escaped Davies's lips. "Everyone knows this land is council leasehold, underwritten by Mr. Harrow. Rourke defaulted on his original purchase years ago." "Did he?" Charlotte asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She turned and walked not to the table where the gun lay, but to a small, heavy wooden chest that sat beside the hearth. It was where she had been storing the mended linens. She knelt, lifted the lid, and took out a folded, yellowed envelope. She rose and walked back to Davies, holding the envelope out to him. "Perhaps you should read this first," she said. Davies looked from the envelope to her face, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He snatched it from her hand, opened it, and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. As he read, the smug, florid color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed pallor. He read it once, then again, his lips moving silently. The paper was a letter, dated 6 months prior. It was from the clerk of Harrow's own land office, addressed to Caleb Rourke. It was a simple, formal acknowledgement asterisk. "This letter serves as confirmation that the final payment of $65 has been received, clearing in full the outstanding debt on the 160-acre parcel known as the Croft Bottomland. The deed is now clear of all liens. Asterisk." At the bottom of the page was a signature, an elegant, confident scrawl that was as recognizable in Dry Hollow as the brand on a man's own cattle. A. Harrow. Davies looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. He looked at Caleb, who had turned from the window and was staring at Charlotte, his own expression one of utter, stunned disbelief. Davies looked back at the letter, then at Charlotte's resolute face. The fight was gone from him. This piece of paper was an unassailable truth. He had come to deliver a notice of eviction and had been met with a declaration of ownership, signed by his own master. Without another word, he crumpled the eviction notice in his fist, turned, and fled. They heard his boots squelching in the mud, the frantic creak of saddle leather, and the sound of his horse galloping away as if the devil himself were on its tail. The silence he left behind was immense. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. Caleb slowly walked from the window to the table. He leaned on it with his good hand, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were burning, raw with an emotion she had never seen in him. It was not just gratitude. It was a profound, soul-shaking awe. His composure, the stony fortress he had built around himself for years, had finally crumbled. Where he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken, "Charlotte, where did you find that?" "In the old wooden chest," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "The one in the root cellar, when I was putting away the winter blankets after the storm. It was in a false bottom." He shook his head, trying to make sense of it. He had forgotten. In the depths of his grief after Eleanor's death, in the haze of his dealings with Harrow, he had made that final payment, a last act of defiance, and had hidden the proof, burying it like he had buried his wife, and then had buried the memory itself. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, trying to understand the magnitude of what she had done. She had not just saved his home, she had saved him from himself, from the resignation that had almost cost him everything. "Why," he asked, the word barely a breath. "You found it days ago. You could have left. Why did you stay? Why help me?" Charlotte took a step closer to him, into the space that his vulnerability had created. She looked directly into his eyes, and the answer she gave was the simplest, most profound truth she had ever spoken. "Because I don't want to just be a passerby in your life." A week passed. The world, which had been buried in white and then drowned in mud, began to heal itself. The ground firmed up under a persistent, gentle sun. The creek, which had run high and brown with meltwater, settled back into its banks, clear and musical. The air lost its biting, wet chill, and turned crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. Inside the small log house, a similar healing was taking place. The taut, brittle silence of survival had been replaced by a quiet so profound it was almost a sound in itself, the sound of peace. Caleb's shoulder was mending. The angry swelling had subsided, and while he still wore the sling, the lines of constant pain had receded from around his eyes and mouth. He moved with a new, careful ease, the grim frustration of his helplessness giving way to a patient acceptance of his recovery. He was no longer just a patient, and Charlotte was no longer just a caregiver. They were two people sharing a space that had, against all odds, become a home. The unspoken words he had uttered during the storm "I don't want you to leave this house" had never been mentioned again, but they resonated in every shared glance, in every small, domestic act. They were the new foundation upon which everything was being built. Their days found a simple, unhurried rhythm. In the mornings, she would help him with the tasks his injury still made difficult, her hands deft and sure as she buckled his belt or helped him pull on his boots. In the afternoons, while he sat on the porch, his face turned toward the sun, letting its warmth seep into his injured shoulder, she would work in the shed, the steady scrape of her awl and the pull of her thread a comforting, industrious sound. They were rebuilding his world, one stitch, one quiet day at a time. One evening, a full week after Davies had fled their porch in disgrace, Charlotte placed 2 steaming bowls of thick rabbit stew on the long pine table. The stew was rich with wild onions and the last of the carrots from her small garden, and the cabin was filled with its savory aroma. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, its light dancing on the scrubbed wooden floor and casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. Caleb sat down opposite her. He moved without the tense, guarded posture she had first known. The constant weight he had carried for years, the shame of his past, the grief for his wife, the fight for his land seemed to have lessened. It was not gone, but he was no longer stooped beneath it. His shoulders were straighter, more relaxed. He looked at the bowl she set before him, then at her, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. They ate in their usual quiet, but the silence was soft and full. It was the silence of two people who had no need for words to fill the space between them. They had faced down the town, the storm, and the past, and had emerged into this small, warm circle of light, irrevocably bound together. When the meal was finished, they sat for a while, sipping hot coffee, watching the fire dance and spit in the hearth. The last of the evening light faded from the sky outside, and the world shrank to the dimensions of this one warm room. Charlotte felt the moment settle, a sense of rightness, of a decision that had been made long ago finally rising to the surface to be spoken. Slowly, deliberately, she set her mug down on the table. She reached across the smooth, worn wood and laid her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him without a practical, nursing purpose. Her hand was small over his large, calloused one. His skin was warm and rough. For a moment, he did not react, did not move. He simply sat there, his gaze fixed on their joined hands on the table. She felt the slight, involuntary tensing of the muscles in his forearm, a flicker of the old, guarded reflex. But then, it passed. He let out a long, slow breath, and she felt the tension leave him completely. He turned his hand over, his fingers curling gently around hers, enveloping them in his strength and warmth. It was an answer, a surrender, an acceptance, all without a single word. She looked at him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. She had to give him the choice. She had to let him speak it. "I can stay," she said, her voice a soft, clear whisper in the quiet room. She did not look away. "If you want me to." He looked at her, truly looked at her, his deep-set eyes holding hers. And then a change came over his face, a slow, wondrous transformation she had never seen before. The corners of his mouth, usually set in a grim, straight line, began to lift. It was not a broad grin, but a slow, quiet, miraculous smile. It was a smile that reached all the way to his eyes, crinkling the corners, filling them with a light she had never thought to see there. It was like watching the sun rise after a very long, very dark night. "We start over," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. The words were a promise, a foundation stone for a future that had, until this very moment, been an impossible dream. Tears pricked at the back of Charlotte's eyes, but she blinked them away. This was not a moment for tears, but for truths. A small, wistful smile touched her own lips. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of the long, hard road that had brought them to this simple, perfect moment. One secret each she whispered, repeating the words that had first bridged the chasm between their solitary worlds. It was a callback to the night on the porch, the night their shared brokenness had first begun to heal into something new. Caleb's smile widened. With his good hand, still holding hers, he gently pulled her, urging her to rise from her chair and come around the table. She stood before him, the firelight warm on her back. He did not let go of her hand. He looked up at her, his face full of a tender, wondering light. "You know most of mine," he said, his voice soft. He had shown her his shame, his grief, his vulnerability. He had laid the pieces of his broken life before her, and she had not run. She had stayed and, with her quiet strength, had helped him put them back together. She looked down at this strong, quiet, wounded man who had offered her shelter and had, in turn, found his own salvation. The last secret, the one that truly mattered, was hers to give. "Then listen to mine," she whispered, and she leaned down, closing the small space between them, her face drawing nearer to his. So close that the world disappeared. So close that there was nothing left but the warmth of the fire, the soft sound of their breathing, and the beginning of a promise whispered in the near dark. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. For extra support, please hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.